Hey everybody, it's Irene with BrainStormAcres, and we're going to get ready for Thanksgiving. This is going to be a little different. Some of you may know, if you've been following us for a while, that we play with a group of people who likes to reenact life before 1600s. We haven't seen our friends since February. So I was chatting online with some friends the other day and they said, hey, you should do a couple of videos just for us. Now, this isn't just for them, but we figured we'd do it a little bit different. I'm going to subtitle this video, "It Doesn't Have to Be Weird to Be Medieval." Let's change up a little bit. Much better. Okay, but I need an apron. It's been a while since I put this apron on. It's not quite as convenient as the ones with the continuous loops at the top, but we don't have documentation for those. There we go. Much better. Okay, today I'm going to be making a Pompillon tart. Now, this is actually a recipe that makes 2 tarts, but the first thing I need to do is make the crust. In our group, we often say, in period. Well, what period are you talking about? Pre-1600, and this would have been relatively late period, 1400s, 1500s. I believe that most of this recipe actually comes from Italy, if I were to check back into my documentation. We see this sort of thing in Italy and the courts, the high courts of England and things like that. The commoners would not have had this, but we don't have to be commoners. We're celebrating Thanksgiving, and celebrating Thanksgiving is actually post-period for us because the Puritans got here just a little after our period. But that's okay, we're gonna ignore that. We have a couple of different kinds of crusts, some of which were intended to be eaten and some of which were not intended to be eaten. So let me get started on this. Okay, I have all my ingredients pre-measured because you really don't need to watch me measure things. So first we're starting with 3 cups of flour. This flour has been sifted with salt. It contains 1½ teaspoons of salt. Now, why would you say, would I bother to sift my flour? Flour is fine enough. Well, the reality is sometimes if you're using a coarser ground flour, it does have pieces of bran in it, which you may or may not want in your crust. Another reason is you get lumps. And sometimes either your flour or your salt is lumpy. I've sifted it. Now, I have ye old hand sifter. If you don't have something like that, plain old sieve will work. But that gets rid of all the lumps. In earlier time frames, it would have also gotten rid of the bugs. I know we don't like to think of that modernly, but it would have taken out any worms or larvae or moths. So we have clean flour ready to go. We've got salt in there. I'm going to add 1 cup of shortening. Now this shortening came out of a container marked Crisco. I get nothing from the Crisco people, by the way. I would prefer not to use it. But to be honest, I can't currently find lard. I can get the shelf-stable lard, but shelf-stable lard is hydrogenated the same way as this junk is hydrogenated. And what I'm actually looking for, and I will find eventually, is a good lard that is not hydrogenated. Hydrogenation is what clogs up your arteries. Regular pure old lard is way better for you, the same way as butter is way better for you than margarine or any other hydrogenated product is. Lard, you said, gosh, your crust is going to taste like pork chops. No, it's not. The finest lard is leaf lard, which comes from the stomach area of the pig on the inside, and it peels off in almost sheets when you peel it off. It is flavorless if handled properly. The better households would have saved the leaf lard for doing things like fine crusts, where they wanted to have just a good flaky crust and no flavor of ye olde pork chop. What about the other lard from a pig? Well, modern lard, when it is rendered, generally comes out fairly flavorless because they can get rid of the flavors. How many of you realize that Buffalo Wild Wings uses beef tallow to fry their fries? Ever wonder why it's so delicious? Beef tallow. It's been deflavored, but it's still beef tallow. So not for vegetarians and vegans. What I'm doing is I'm cutting in the shortening here. I'm also going to add 3 tablespoons of butter. Whoops, which I just dropped, of course. Boink. There we go. And I'm going to cut this the same way. And my goal is to get this fully incorporated, but not mushy. We want the flour to be sort of crumbly. I would do the same thing if I were making biscuits. That fat in there, whether in the form of lard or butter or shortening, is what makes the flakes appear in your crust. It separates the layers of dough into flakiness. And that is what most of us have come to truly enjoy. Now, if all you ever had is store-bought pies, you may never have had a truly flaky crust. My husband was rather in the habit of throwing away crusts when we were married because he had had too many pie crusts that came from stores, especially at university. And yeah, it's not the same. Now, I don't want to do this too much because I don't want to make it tough, but I can see I've still got a couple of pieces here that are just a little bit too big. So I'm specifically focusing on those because I don't want big lumps of fat in there. It's moderately warm in the kitchen today, so I'm probably going to have to chill this a little bit longer than usual. And the big trick with dough is chilling it. Okay, I'm going to say that's enough, and if I find an extra big piece later, I will simply chop it up. Now, if you don't have something like this cutter for cutting in the fat into your dough, you can use a couple of knives. I've done that before, where you just hold it between your hands, like your fingers, and do like that. You can use a wide tine fork. But I'm going to now add my water. This is 1/4 cup of water, cool, plus 2 tablespoons of water. That is usually enough. Sometimes, because we are in such a dry climate, it is not enough. So I'm going to sort of let this sit for about 2 minutes. Then I'm going to start mixing it together gently. Now, earlier I mentioned that there were 2 basic types of crusts that we see in the medieval time frame. Those that were intended to be eaten and those that were not intended to be eaten. They had some that they actually called a crust. They also had another thing that was called a coffin. Now, in that time frame, the word coffin simply means box. And if you think about it, a coffin is a box. We rather elaborated it today, and we tend to associate it with funerals, but back then it was simply a box. Coffins were made with rather thick slabs of flour and water, sometimes some other ingredients, but they were using inexpensive things, relatively speaking, and they created containers in which food was cooked. Now, the wealthy folks who had this done for them, the people living in the castles and such, did not eat the coffins. It was kind of like some of the fancy meals where you break something open, and this is the part that's on the outside, you don't eat it. That crust, the coffin part, was later fed to either the servants, the poor people, or the pigs and chickens, because it would have had juices from the meat and vegetables or anything else that was cooked in it, and it would have had some nutritional value. And to the poor, to be given anything to eat was a giant blessing. So they were thrilled to get something as a member of the court, I never would have eaten the coffin, but modernly, we don't use coffins too often in feast arrangements. And if we do, we usually try to make them a wee bit more edible. Now, I have extra water here just in case, and I think I'm going to add a little bit. This is also cool water. When I used to make this recipe in other parts of the world, I didn't have to add extra water, but here, because we are such low humidity, I often do. Okay, that looks like it's going to come together. I'm trying not to stir much, I'm just sort of smooshing it together. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to put this into a piece of saran wrap, roll it tight into a ball, and let it rest in the fridge for half an hour. I could also use tin foil or anything else that I can ball up. It does need to be something that I can ball up, because I'm going to scrape this out of here, put it together in a lump, and pack it together quite literally so that it can spread the moisture evenly throughout the dough. Now remember, this is going to make 2 crusts, because the recipe that we have for Pompillon tart makes 2 tarts. Now, in this case, a tart is just a pie, and Pompillon is a fancy word for pumpkin. Okay, not bad. I may add another piece of wrapper to this, we'll see. See how well we wrap. Not too bad. Now, unfortunately, my refrigerator is, as most people, right the day before Thanksgiving, a bit on the overcrowded side. Okay, into the fridge.